Okay, hi everyone. So we just finished talking about the SAT scoring system in the last lesson, and the final thing that we left off with was that it's a good idea normally to take a guess. As long as you can eliminate any answer choice, it's always a good idea to guess. But the last thing that I said was that you don't necessarily want to you don't want to try to answer every question on the test unless your score is very, very high. If you're going for a very high score, you do want to answer all the questions on the test. But even if you are going for a great score, you still want to understand order of difficulty on the test because it's a very important concept. So what do I mean by order of difficulty? Well, when I say order of difficulty, what I really am referring to is predictable order of difficulty. So we'll say predictable OOD. What do I mean by predictable? Well, I mean that on certain parts of this test, you can tell simply by looking at the question number whether a question is an easy question, a medium question, or a hard question. And when I say easy, medium, or hard question, what I mean is that most people who are answering these questions respond in a certain way. And the SAT is able to predict this because they test out questions using the PSAT and using the experimental section of the SAT. They use you as guinea pigs, basically. It's a big experiment to see how difficult questions are. So if I call a question easy, what that means is that most people answer it correctly. Okay? If a question is a medium level difficulty, it usually means about half the people who answer that question answer it correctly. And then if I refer to a hard question, it means that most people are answering it incorrectly. Okay? So it doesn't just mean that it's easy or hard to do from a subjective perspective. It's a real statistical analysis of how many students answer that particular question correctly. So, getting back to predictable OOD, there is one place on the SAT that has predictable order of difficulty on every single question, and that would be the math section. Okay, so we said before in our introduction that there are 3 math sections, and they have differing amounts of questions. There's a 20 question section, an 18 question section, and a 16 question section. All right, let's start with the 20 question section. Right, the 20 question section is all multiple choice. Right, so it goes from number 1 to number 20, and it's just all multiple choice questions. So in terms of order of difficulty, it's pretty simple. Starts off easy, in the middle it's medium, and at the end it's hard. Right? Now, what too many students do when they take this this particular math section is they feel like in order to get a good score on the test, they need to answer all of the questions. And it's really just not true, because what happens to most students, right, when they take this test is that on the first half they rush through the first 10, and these are, technically easy medium questions, but because they're rushing, they often make careless mistakes. And then, of course, in the last half of the test, they slow down a little bit, but it doesn't really matter because they're hard questions and they get them wrong anyway. Now, what you really should be doing on this particular section is you should be taking your time on the first half of questions. You don't want to go too slowly, but you want to go slowly enough so that you don't make any careless mistakes. So you go on what I would call cruise control. You don't rush, you don't panic. you just make sure that you get everything right, because remember, these questions are worth the same amount of points as the hard questions. And then on the harder half, you just have to be selective. Remember that you don't have to answer every question, and that it probably makes sense to leave some questions at the end blank, depending on what your score is. Okay? Now, that's the 20-question math section. There's also the 18-question math section, which is a little bit different, because the 18-question math section is part multiple choice and part grid-ins. And when I say grid-ins, I mean those questions where you have to provide your own answer. There's no multiple choice. So for the 18-question section, right? Here's how it works. The first part is multiple choice, and that part has its own order of difficulty. And then the second part is grid-ins, right? And that has its own order of difficulty. Right? And a lot of students don't realize this, but what happens is you want to make sure that you answer the easy questions first and get those out of the way, because remember, like I said, every question has the same amount of points. So what a lot of students would benefit from doing is skipping these hard questions, skipping number 7 or 8, and then, just going directly to the easy questions on the grid-ins. And then if you have time, sure, go ahead and try the hard questions. But in this section, it doesn't actually make sense to answer the questions in order sometimes. You might want to skip numbers 7 and 8. Okay. So that's the math section. And then in terms of the critical reading and the writing sections, there is no predictable order of difficulty on the critical reading or the writing. You do not know simply by the number of a question what the order of difficulty is, right? So for the critical reading and the writing, there is no predictable order of difficulty. So what do you do? Well, here's the thing. You still don't have to answer every question, right? Oh, and by the way, there is some order of difficulty on the critical reading. The sentence completions have predictable order of difficulty. So we'll just say POOD. YouTube limits me to 10 minutes for these lessons, so I have to be a little bit brief sometimes. But anyway, the sentence completions have POOD, so often, the last couple, you might want to skip the last couple sentence completions because those words are often really hard, or at least take an educated guess, but more importantly, don't waste too much time on those sentence completions. But otherwise, for the critical reading and the writing, since you don't know how hard a question is, you can't skip it just based on the number. But what you can do is, you know that you don't have to answer all the questions, so skip the ones that are hard for you. So what I mean by that is, if you see a question like on the critical reading that's really hard to understand, skip it. It's not a big deal. You do not have to, on the SAT, you don't have to answer all the questions in order. Because on the math section, you want to try to answer the earlier questions because you know that those are easier. But on the critical reading or the writing, it doesn't really matter. So especially for the critical reading, it makes sense to skip around. As far as the writing goes, it's okay to skip a few here and there, although for the writing, I really do encourage my students to try to answer as many questions as possible. The questions are shorter and usually a little bit easier to understand. Remember that if you can eliminate at least one answer choice, you should guess, and normally most students are able to do that on the writing section. So on the writing, I wouldn't skip too many questions.